Good morning and welcome to the EUMENIA lecture on EU, the UN, and the Israeli Palestinian conflict. The European Union's quest to become a more prominent actor in world politics has always comprised a dominant issue in the agenda of the EU leaders over the last decades. The EU, as one of the most successful formats of regional integration across the globe, strives to promote its own political goals at the international level. The adoption of the Lisbon Treaty in December 2009 made a considerable breakthrough toward this direction by unifying the EU foreign policy apparatus, and many signs of optimism are evident that the EU has become more coherent in its approach to external action and international relations. However, the complex intra-EU environment and the diverse political interests of the EU member states always constitute a formidable obstacle for the formulation and the enhancement of an EU coherent policy approach in world politics. When it comes to the UN, member states typically still take center stage in relation to all principal functions of the UN, may that be mediation, monitoring, peacekeeping, or humanitarian action. In the UN General Assembly since 1977, the member state holding the presidency of the European Council represented the European Community. Since 2011, the EU has its own voice. In the UN Security Council, member states seek to coordinate too. Despite these efforts, though, European incoherence still affects the impact the EU can have within the UN, and this can be particularly well evidenced for its voting behavior in the UN's principal organs. Today's topic will focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with the aim to examine the coherence of the EU as a regional bloc in the United Nations. In doing so, we will use a methodological framework which compares the EU oral and voting coherence in the UN General Assembly. We will focus on the UN General Assembly as, in difference to the UN Security Council, all EU member states are present and can be taken into consideration. Particularly, we will examine how the EU has developed a certain set of principles over the years regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We will spot the EU coherence at the international level, in this case, to the UN General Assembly. And finally, we will identify the limitations of the EU's coherent action via the investigation of the EU behavior concerning two specific UN General Assembly resolutions pertaining to the conflict. We will see that even though the EU oral stance often seems to be significantly coherent, the voting behavior of the EU member states is considerably incoherent regarding to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let us first look at what oral and voting incoherence and coherence of the EU means when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A persistent issue of concern for the EU is to appear with a coherent face in the world political arena. Typically, when we refer to the EU, coherence pertains to the intra-EU dimension of EU international interactions. That is, the internal capacity of the EU to emerge as a cohesive, authoritative, and autonomous player in the international arena, and to become recognized by the other negotiating partners as such. We have both oral and voting coherence. The oral coherence concerns the capacity of the EU and its member states to speak with one voice, while the voting coherence is when the EU member states vote with the same manner in a voting procedure. Coherence could be observed in two levels. At a micro level, namely within the EU level, where the EU member states bargain for common policy positions, and B, at the macro level, namely at the international level, where the EU uploads its agreed positions and negotiates in international fora. The majority of the existing scholarly literature that examines the EU role at the UN setting focuses on the voting behavior of the EU member states. The basic research scope of this kind of literature is to identify convergent and divergent trends in the voting attitudes of the EU member states over time and regarding particular policy areas. Yet, the EU oral interventions and subsequently the EU oral coherence and incoherence is a foundational dimension of the EU and its member states' behavior at the UN General Assembly. This aspect is put forward in the work of EACEA. They have proposed a methodological framework that takes into consideration simultaneously the oral and the voting behavior of the EU and its member states. The table here depicts a matrix that illustrates the four possible cases of oral voting: inconsistency and consistency. The first entry, #1, identifies cases when EU member states speak with one voice and vote to the same direction. The second entry, #2, depicts cases in which the EU member states speak with an aligned voice but vote differently. The third entry, #3, pertains to the cases whereby EU member states vote similarly but express differences in their oral interventions. And finally, the fourth entry, #4, shows the situation when EU member states speak differently and do not vote in the same manner. As we will see in the Israeli-Palestinian context, the most of the cases lie in matrix cells either #1 or #2. Let us now turn to the intra-EU level and see how the EU oral coherence for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has developed over time. The formulation of the EU's official position towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict comprises a striking case of how a joint position of the EU regarding a policy issue has been gradually constructed and hand in hand to the evolution of the EU foreign policy over the decades. In the 1970s and the 1980s, the political position of the EC was fundamentally based on political declarations within the European political cooperation context and essentially on the humanitarian assistance provided by the European Commission and the EU member states. During the early 1990s, the main direction of the EU was to be diplomatically present in the ongoing negotiations of the settlement of the conflict. However, this approach was profoundly constrained between the political will of the EU to find a solution, and more importantly, a peace settlement for the conflict, and the EU internal limitations in synthesizing a common position towards the conflict. The gap between what the EU could do as a competent actor in world affairs and its capacity to reach these expectations has been well depicted by the mismatch between the highly engaged rhetoric that the EU has used concerning the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and its concrete engagements. Nevertheless, a few important political texts have set up and demarcated sufficiently the political approach of the EU towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. These texts stem from diverse EC and EU declarations over time, demonstrated over the years, either in international fora or within the EU context, dating back from 1971 to nowadays. In these texts, the EU has managed to put forward a set of principles regarding its stance toward the conflict, such as the recognition of the Security Council Resolution 242, the recognition of the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, the recognition of a homeland for the Palestinian people, the right to self-determination, the recognition of a Palestinian state in due course, the two-state solution, the recognition of Jerusalem as future capital of both states, the inapplicability of the Israel agreement to the territories occupied by Israel in 1967, and many more principles. So let's see how the EU coherence is depicted at the international level. There is a strong and rich declarative output of the EU regarding the conflict, as we saw. But what is happening when the EU wants to transfer and promote this intra-EU output to the international level? I will try to answer this question by looking at the EU's coherence regarding the conflict within the UN General Assembly. One of the core international contexts in which the EU is striving to promote its political objectives is, of course, the UN General Assembly. As a complex negotiating environment where numerous states, regional organizations, and diverse sorts of entities are expressing their goals and sponsoring their political interests, the UN General Assembly comprises undoubtedly a unique forum the EU can enhance its impact as a political power in world affairs. Europe's commitment to effective multilateralism as depicted in various EU official documents portrays the EU as a global political actor firmly engaged in promoting and enhancing the values of the UN system. In the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this is even more germane. The first EC declaration on the issue has clear attachments to the UN documents, to Security Council resolutions 242 and 388. Following that, all related to the conflict EU official documentation is based on the value palette that the UN context is producing from time to time. The UN General Assembly setting has played a vital role in the consolidation and the evolution of the European joint stance towards the conflict. For instance, it was via the framework of the UN General Assembly from which the EC's position was developed until the 34th session in 1979, when for the first time the European community explicitly declared that the PLO should be associated to the negotiations. In addition to that, the EU member states have been capable to deliver oral statements in the UN framework, which are completely in line with the EU jointly official positions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In this respect, one would argue that the UN General Assembly has always comprised a negotiating context in which the EU can speak with a single voice regarding this major conflict. Let us now turn to the voting attitude of the EU member states, where we find some mixed evidence, let's say, over time. When it comes to the voting records of the EU member states regarding the UN General Assembly resolutions related to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, one can witness periods of aligned votes and periods of divergent trends. Nevertheless, the Israeli-Palestinian issue is an excellent case for the EU to be converted to a dominant player, having the ability to muster significant numbers of votes, as Leitikainen and Smith have argued, and to increase as such its bargaining power through collective voting. For example, the EU has been treated as a coherent bloc by the Arab states introducing the draft resolutions pertaining to the conflict. Through this way, the EU can intervene ex ante in the formulation of any text through processed and proposed amendments. At the same time, when there is a coordinated EU vote, it could typically attract more than 20 non-Arab member states of the UN General Assembly who could align themselves with the formal EU position. So there is room for maneuver. Each year, within the UN General Assembly sessions, approximately 20 resolutions are being debated with regard to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The deliberations are taking place in the plenary and the second, the third, and the fourth committees of the UN General Assembly. The EU and its member states are striving to coordinate their positions for a topic which is highly controversial, and divergent political stance are typically the normality than the exception. Traditionally, there is an ingrained division among the EU member states, whereby some are closer to Israel, such as the Netherlands, Germany, or the Czech Republic. Some are closer to the Palestinians, such as Spain, Ireland, or Sweden, and others vary their stance, such as Italy or Greece. Putting this in context, it is interesting to note that on other conflicts, the EU member states do succeed to vote coherently. As the graph on the voting behavior of those EU member states present in the UN Human Rights Council from the EU Middle East project shows, Israel, Palestine stands out in incoherent voting behavior of the member states. Thus, it is particularly on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that the majority of the cases regarding to the dispute could be categorized in #2, if you remember, namely the EU member states speak with the same language but vote differently despite their agreement on the oral level. To explain this better, let's see two cases where one would see the limits of the EU oral coherence. Whereas the EU and its member states have the intention to articulate a common language for a specific topic, it is very difficult for them to avoid an oral voting split during the crucial voting procedure. In order to better understand it, we will focus on two major UN resolutions: the Goldstone Report and the upgrade of the Status of Palestine resolution. The Goldstone Report, voted by the plenary of the UN General Assembly in November 2009, advised both Israelis and Palestinians to undertake, quote, independent, credible investigations, unquote, into serious violations of international humanitarian and human rights law committed during the Gaza conflict in December 2008. The main conclusion of the report was that both Hamas and Israel had gone very far with the war fatalities and committed possibly war crimes during the tension. The voting procedures in the UN Human Rights Council in September 2009 was noticeably contentious since Italy, Hungary, the Netherlands, and Slovakia rejected the report, while Belgium and Slovenia abstained from the voting, and France and the UK did not vote at all. When the report left the Human Rights Council and arrived at the plenary of the UN General Assembly, the EU voting coherence was once again fragmented. Cyprus, Ireland, Malta, Portugal, and Slovenia voted yes. The Czech Republic, Germany, Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, and Slovakia voted no. And Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Greece, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Romania, Spain, Sweden, and the UK abstained. The coordination process followed for the Goldstone Report was a bit unusual from the mainstream procedures of the EU coordination in similar circumstances. While the majority of coordinating mechanisms are taking place in Brussels prior to a vote in the UN General Assembly, especially with regard to human rights topics, the case of the Goldstone Report was coordinated through a different approach. Each EU member state expressed its own national position, and the bulk of deliberations for a coordinated stance took place in Geneva in the Human Rights Council and in New York in the General Assembly. The coordination efforts of the Swedish EU presidency were colossal to formulate and reach a common position among the EU member states. And more than that, to find cooperative paths between the EU and the Palestinian delegation. The basic objective for the EU was to promote the principle in the UN diplomatic circles at the UN General, that the UN General Assembly should quote unquote endorse the Human Rights Council report and not use a less binding languages such as quote takes notice, unquote, or, quote, takes note with appreciation, unquote. For instance, the Dutch delegation insisted on clear principles and the EU worked for a more moderate language in the resolution. However, the language the EU supported for the resolution was rejected by Palestine. During February 2010, a second resolution on this matter was voted in the UN General Assembly. The EU member states were divided in two camps. Austria, Belgium, Cyprus, and many more voted yes, while Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, and many more abstained. This result provoked a furious reaction from the Palestinians, who underscored the ineffectiveness of the EU to bind to its own oral statements regarding human rights abuses and pinpointed the use of a double standards policy. The EU appeared divided during the debate for the resolution. Several statements were voiced from the EU member states which were not in line with the EU common position. The fact that the Goldstone Report has not been mentioned in any official EU Council document is quite revealing. The only exception is two resolutions which have been voted by the European Parliament in 2010 and were striving to adopt and synthesize a common position on the issue. On 30 November 2009, during the plenary debate of the UN General Assembly, Sweden, speaking on behalf of the EU, did not make any reference to the Goldstone Report, neither the relevant UNGA resolution. The EU statement was only limited to references to the basic EU principles regarding the conflict, including the legal character of settlements and the need for a two-state solution. Let us now turn to the second resolution, the Status of Palestine. If the Goldstone Report showed emphatically how difficult it is for the EU to formulate a common approach as a unified regional bloc in the UN General Assembly, the resolution which concerns the status of Palestine in the UN reveals how complex it is for the EU to overcome the different national preferences and sensitivities regarding particular policy issues. After the breakdown of the so-called proximity talks introduced in March 2010 between the Israelis and the Palestinians, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, presented on September 2011 a formal application for statehood before the Security Council. However, the attempt of Abbas for full UN membership had small chances to pass since, of course, the US had already expressed their intention to veto the text. For the EU, this was a crucial moment to test their unity on a sensitive issue within an international setting such as the UN General Assembly. On early September 2011, the foreign ministers of the EU member states gathered in Poland to prepare the positions of the EU for the forthcoming UN General Assembly. Apparently, the main topic of the discussion was the position of the EU regarding the Palestinian bid and how it can be formulated as a joint EU approach. Germany and Italy publicly opposed the bid, and instead of seeking a common position, the EU member states chose to support a quartet statement as an alternative to a UN resolution. On the 23rd of September in 2011, the quartet recommended concrete steps for the reopening of direct bilateral talks between the interested parties. This was a sort of a strategic move in order to minimize anticipated EU divisions over a possible vote at the UN General Assembly. However, the divisions among the EU member states soon came to the fore. In October 2011, the Palestinians pursued and received membership in UNESCO. The EU was divided into three blocs: Austria, Belgium, Cyprus, Finland, France, Greece, Ireland, and many more voted yes. Traditionally, the Czech Republic, Germany, Lithuania, the Netherlands, and Sweden voted no. and Bulgaria, Denmark, and the United Kingdom, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, Estonia, and Hungary abstained from the resolution. About a year later, in 2012, the Palestinians pushed for a second bid to join the UNGA. As a non-member observer state, they were assured that a positive outcome would be probable since 131 countries had already recognized Palestine as an independent yet occupied state. For the EU, that was one of the greatest battlefields, as Boris mentions, concerning the Palestinian bid. On the one hand, most of the UN member states had expressed their desire to vote in favor. On the other hand, there was a US and Israel, which were completely antithetical about it. Therefore, the vote of the EU would carry a symbolic political burden and importance as a power promoting and consolidating moral legitimacy in world affairs. Nevertheless, the EU member states could not respond to such an important challenge. On November 2012, the UN General Assembly conferred Palestine a non-member observer state status with a vast majority of 138 votes in favor to 9 against. Among the negative votes, it was the Czech Republic for the EU side, Bulgaria, Estonia, Germany, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Poland, Romania, but to name a few, abstained, and Austria, Belgium, Cyprus, Finland, France, Greece, and many more voted yes. The head of the EU delegation during the debate for the Palestinian bid repeated the EU's commitment to recognize a Palestinian state, quote unquote, when appropriate, and urge the parties to avoid unilateral measures that would undermine the two-state solution. Compared to the EU's behavior for the Goldstone Report, the split over the Palestine status came 2 years after the adoption of Resolution 65/276 that conferred an enhanced observer status to the EU in the UN General Assembly. And its main scope was to unify the presence and the impact of the EU in the wider UN context. The latter objectives would be accomplished by the minimization of individual European voices during the official meetings of the UN General Assembly and by the articulation of an EU single voice, ideally expressed via the EU delegation in New York. However, the EU attitude towards the Palestinian status barely reflects these aspirations. So, we have attempted to highlight the EU's approach towards the conflict and to shed light on how the EU and its member states behave as a coherent regional bloc in the UN General Assembly. We showed that since the early 70s, the EU has managed to formulate a common policy regarding the tension based on irrefutable principles such as the need for a two-state solution, the establishment of Jerusalem as future capital of two states, the necessity for economic reorganization of Gaza, to name but a few. When the EU transfers its agreed policy output from the intra-EU level to the international landscape, we have recognized considerable problems that condition its behavior. The most important problem concerns that the EU member states have diverse political preferences and interests regarding numerous policy areas and cases, and this constrains the EU in acting as a coherent bloc in international fora. The behavior of the EU for the two resolutions about the Goldstone Report and the status of Palestine in the UN General Assembly confirm the difficulties that the EU faces when sensitive political issues are at stake at the international level. Mosu has characterized the EU's approach towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a case of quote-unquote converging parallels. meaning that the member states converge towards a common position, but they never assign totally their respective national interest to the Central European mechanisms. In other words, the EU position towards the conflict is based on the lowest common denominator doctrine that severely characterizes the EU foreign policy. This also happens at the level of the Security Council. The member states had, for example, closely cooperated on Security Council Resolution 2334, which had been influenced by the EU's differentiation policy, as it called, quote, upon all states, bearing in mind paragraph 1 of the resolution, to distinguish in their relevant dealings between the territory of the State of Israel and the territories occupied since 1967, unquote. The EU member states have also coordinated sanctions on Syria. Furthermore, in light of the EU Foreign Affairs Council being increasingly blocked on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by some member states, the UN Security Council has been used as a forum of member states present in the Security Council to voice united positions. Nevertheless, as in the UNGA setting, there have also been splits in the Security Council, for instance, regarding Resolution 1973 on Libya, where the UK and France closely coordinated, but Germany abstained, or on the US-led 2003 Iraq intervention, where a deep split has run through Europe, as you might remember. The Security Council is also a forum where the European member states present can potentially cooperate with the rotating member states of the Arab League. This happened, for example, in 2014, when Jordan tabled a resolution on behalf of the Arab League to impose a 12-month deadline on a negotiated solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This resolution, however, failed to be adopted due to a split in the European vote. Whilst France supported the resolution, the UK and Lithuania abstained, and the resolution thus failed to gain the necessary 9 votes. Thus, it is not only in the EU's own incoherence which harms its influence in the international community, but also its lack of ability or willingness to cooperate with regional institutions such as the Arab League and the United Nations for a more effective diplomacy in the region. And indeed, this is an issue where much more research would still be needed. So, where do we stand? Let us take the time and consider some basic questions regarding the EU international action in general and towards the conflict in particular. I would encourage you to focus on the following 3 questions. What are the limitations of the EU internal output transferred to the international level? How is the EU foreign policy coordination applied within the UNGA context? And what are the prospects of the EU's action towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Finally, here are some very basic readings to add to your list. I hope you have enjoyed the video, and I thank you for your time.